Schopenhauer's philosophy begins where the philosophy of Immanuel Kant ends. In fact, in the foreword to The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer makes the explicit demand of the reader to acquaint himself with the Kantian philosophy. In order to firmly understand Schopenhauer, it is therefore necessary to quickly reiterate the main points of Kant's philosophy. In particular, we'll discuss what Schopenhauer called Kant's greatest accomplishment. Consider the world. We tend to think that what we see is what we get, in the sense that we believe that the world as we perceive it is the world as it really is. When you see a tree, you assume that the tree is actually there in an objective sense. You don't believe you're dreaming or hallucinating. In other words, you believe in a real, objective reality, and you believe your senses give you reliable information on the nature of that reality. The accomplishment of Kant exists in showing that this is not the case. Your knowledge of the tree is mediated, not immediate. What this means is that the image of the tree, as you perceive it, is not pure. It has passed through the filter of your mind, so to speak. Kant's accomplishment was to show that there is no black and white distinction between subject, that is, you, the perceiving agent, and object, the tree that you're seeing. The subject is an active agent and not just a passive observer. What does this mean? It means that your perception of the world is shaped by your mind. The three major tools your mind uses to make the image you see are space, time, and causality. Let's take a step back and see what is really said here, because it's important to understand. Kant is saying that time and space are not properties of the things in themselves. Your mind receives raw data, goes to work, and delivers a picture molded in the forms of space and time. In other words, space and time are not properties of objective reality. The mind plays an active role in shaping your perception of the world. Like a filter, it adds a layer of reality to make the raw data intelligible in terms of time and space. So, what does this objective reality, without time and space then, look like? There's the rub, because there is no way to know. Why? Because you're a human with a human mind. You can never perceive things objectively because you will always be a subject. You cannot escape your mind and perceive the world independent of it. By virtue of you being a subject, true objectivity is impossible. For example, consider the following thought experiment. Imagine a world without humans. What does this look like? Maybe you're thinking of a desert, but the image in your mind is still from your perspective as a human. To imagine a world without humans, a world without perceiving subjects, is impossible because you cannot escape your own mind. The material world is contingent upon there being a subject. In other words, there is no object without a subject. In Kant's own words, if I take away the thinking subject, the whole material world must vanish, as this world is nothing but the phenomenal appearance in the sensibility of our own subject, and is a species of this subject's representations. For Schopenhauer, this is Kant's greatest accomplishment, the discovery of the following truth. There is no object without a subject. Objective reality is not as objective as you think. But where does this leave us? What can we hope to discover about this strange objective reality, this reality without subjects? Can we know anything about how the world really is without the meddling of our own mind? In other words, is truly metaphysical knowledge possible? In our thought experiment, we have shown how it's impossible to escape from the mind, so to speak, and to take in a truly objective viewpoint. This is why, according to Kant, Knowledge of the world as it really is impossible. This leaves us stranded. We can never look beyond the limits of our mind and take a peek behind the curtain of the material world. Schopenhauer, however, disagrees. Schopenhauer discovered the single narrow door to the truth. Part 2. The narrow door. This is Schopenhauer's starting point. Like Kant, he believes there can be no object without a perceiving subject. But, unlike Kant, he believes that objective, metaphysical knowledge is possible after all. How? Consider your body. Schopenhauer notices a strange duality in how humans perceive their own bodies. On the one hand, we experience our body as an object among objects. That is to say, I can look at my hand or my arm in the way a sculptor or a biologist might look at it. In this way of looking at things, my hand is not that different from the glass of water on my desk. Both are objects of the material world, situated in time and space. Of course, that's not the whole story. Because, on the other hand, I can feel my body. I feel as if I live in it. This body is mine. I can command its movements, feel its pain, notice its hunger, notice its thirst. In this way, my body is not just one object among many. In this way, my body is really mine, a unique object, one of its kind. In short, the body reveals itself to us in two distinct ways. The first way, as an object among objects, is what Schopenhauer calls representation. The second way, in which we feel as if we live in our bodies, the way in which we feel hunger and pain and love, this way he calls will. So we say that our body appears to us both as will and as representation. The fact that the body appears to us as will is what Schopenhauer called the narrow door to the truth. Because when we've established that the body is both will and representation, we must immediately ask ourselves the question, what about the rest of the world? Could it be that, just like my body, the rest of the world is also both will and representation? There are two possible answers to this question. Either my body, and my body alone, is a completely unique object in the universe. It would be the only object that is both will and representation. For Schopenhauer, this leads to a kind of theoretical egoism, the belief that only I exist and that the rest of the world is mere fancy. But this is not a tenable option for Schopenhauer. Theoretical egoism can never be demonstrably refuted. Yet in philosophy it has never been used otherwise than as a skeptical sophism, i.e. a pretense. As a serious conviction, on the other hand, it could only be found in a madhouse, and as such it stands in need of a cure rather than a refutation. Rather, we must go with the other option. The entire world must be will, not just my own body. My body is not unique. It is as much will as the rest of the universe is will. The only difference is that it's impossible for me to experience the will of the world, while it is possible for me to experience the will of my own body. Schopenhauer's narrow door to the truth is this: to infer from the intimate knowledge of our own body the existence of a will at work throughout the entire universe. What can we say about this will? First, we can say what the will is not. Recall how, following Immanuel Kant, time, space, and causality fall in the domain of the representation. In other words, concepts like time and space are not applicable to the will. The will is simply not the kind of thing that has a time and a space. This is impossible for our reason to comprehend, in the sense that we literally cannot imagine a spaceless, timeless thing. But that's why the will, outside of the small glimpse we experience through our bodies, is necessarily foreign to us. If the will is spaceless and timeless, then it follows that the will is undifferentiated in time and space. What does this mean? To use a metaphor, it means that the will is one. In the domain of the will, there are no different things. Multiplicity, the existence of multiple things, is not applicable to the will because multiplicity requires a spatial element. Of the will, Schopenhauer says, it is free from all multiplicity, although its manifestations in time and space are innumerable. It is itself one, though not in the sense in which an object is one, for the unity of an object can only be known in opposition to a possible multiplicity, nor yet in a sense in which a concept is one, for the unity of a concept originates only in abstraction from a multiplicity. But it is one as that which lies outside time and space, the principium individua,tionis, i.e. the possibility of multiplicity. Only when all this has become quite clear to us through the subsequent examination of the phenomena and different manifestations of the will, shall we fully understand the meaning of the Kantian doctrine that time, space, and causality do not belong to the thing in itself, but are only forms of knowing. This idea is extremely important, because in its consequences we will find the basis for Schopenhauer's ethics. But for now, Schopenhauer invites us to look at the world around us, knowing that beneath it all lies a strange, mysterious will. He invites us to look at the world with this new knowledge in the back of our heads. After looking inwards, we are now asked to look outwards. Part 3. The Will in Nature. Up until this point, Schopenhauer's observations have been of a theoretical nature. Schopenhauer has shown that a strange, mysterious will lies hidden beneath all of nature, from the loftiest galaxies to the simplest blade of grass. At this point, Schopenhauer wants to discuss the characteristics of this will. In order to do so, it's necessary to abandon theoretical arguments and take a look at the world as it shows itself to us. In other words, it's time to go from a theoretical to an empirical point of view. Schopenhauer looks at the world in a scientific manner and tries to uncover fundamental principles that show its inner workings. The world as will and representation is full of examples of such empirical observations. He makes two important observations. First, that the world is full of suffering. In a particularly grim passage, he tells us the story of explorer Jung Han, who relates that he saw on the island of Java a plain as far as the eye could reach, entirely covered with skeletons, and took it for a battlefield. They were, however, merely the skeletons of large turtles, which come this way out of the sea in order to lay their eggs, and are then attacked by wild dogs, who, with their united strength, lay them on their backs, strip off the small shell of the stomach, and so devour them alive. But often then a tiger pounces upon the dogs. Now all this misery repeats itself thousands and thousands of times, year out, year in. For this, then, these turtles are born. For whose guilt must they suffer this torment? Wherefore the whole scene of horror? Human history is the tale of one bloody conflict leading to another. Even plants suffer a great deal, for their entire lives revolve around the struggle for sunlight. Schopenhauer's first observation, namely that to exist means to suffer, stands in sharp contrast to his second observation, namely all that exists wants to live. Schopenhauer notes, very much ahead of his time, that procreation and self-preservation seem to be the chief occupations of all that lives. That may sound obvious today, but remember, Schopenhauer wrote his major work some 40 years before Darwin published On the Origin of Species, and almost an entire century before the age of Freud. Because of this observed struggle for procreation and self-preservation, Schopenhauer will sometimes speak of the will to life instead of simply of the will. It should be remembered, however, that the will to life is not simply a motivation of living beings, but that the will encompasses all of reality, even inorganic matter such as rocks and rivers. It's just that in the organic world, these motivations are most clearly seen. So this is the world according to Schopenhauer. A vale of tears, unending suffering, suffering that is in part created by ourselves in our vain attempts to prolong life. Because after all, do we not cause suffering when we eat plants or animals? Just as the lion kills the gazelle to stay alive? But why must this be the case? At this point, Schopenhauer has merely observed the suffering of the world and not explained it. If his philosophy of the will is to really be a metaphysical explanation of the world, then the will must explain why the world is as it is. And that's exactly what Schopenhauer does. Remember how in part 2 we discussed how the will is undifferentiated in time and space? In other words, how the will is one? What this means is that beyond the illusory world of the representation, beyond the world as we ordinarily experience it, there is no you or me, no here or there, no this, no that. There is just will and nothing else. In the domain of the will, that is to say, on the deepest, most fundamental level, all of existence is one big whole. This is because, as we've seen, the will is beyond time and beyond space. So why is there suffering in the world? Because there is multiplicity instead of unity. The world as representation, which comes into existence with a perceiving subject, divides the unified world of the will into the categories of object and subject first, and in the categories of time, space, and causality second. In the domain of the will, there are no different things, and therefore no conflict. Because where would the conflict be? There is simply will and nothing else. It's only in the representation, that is to say, in the world of our experience, that conflict can arise, because now there is a you versus a me, a wolf versus rabbit, hunter versus prey. But deep down, beyond the illusion of the representation, we are one and the same, a great undivided whole. The biggest mistake, says Schopenhauer, is that we are not aware of this basic truth. Therefore, with the same necessity with which the stone falls to the earth, the hungry wolf buries its fangs in the flesh of its prey, without the possibility of the knowledge that it is itself the destroyed, as well as the destroyer. The fundamental truth can be restated as follows. There is no you and the world. On a fundamental level, you and the world are one and the same. There is no principle of individuation. Schopenhauer is fond of using the Latin term "principium individulationis" that separates you from the world. All is one. This is the basic idea of Schopenhauer's metaphysics. Of course, now that we know this, the question arises, what do we do? In other words, it's time to discuss ethics.